Welcome to Dead Giveaway, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of playing giving. I'm your host, Matt Treadwell. Join me as I sit down with inspiring professionals who are shaping legacies and making a lasting impact, one gift at a time. Let's dig in.
My name is Joe Bull. I am the founder and principal counsel of Philanthropy Advisory Counsel, a wide-ranging gift planning consulting firm. We do fractional gift planning for organizations that don't have the resources to hire somebody full-time. We also do assessments or audits of gift planning programs using the National Standards of Gift Planning Success as our basis. And then we are developing a financial literacy training program that we're about to roll out.
Wanted to know, how did you originally get into philanthropy and playing giving?
Through the back door. I'm not sure that I know anybody that didn't kind of come in through the side door or the back door. I think there may be now people that are seeing this as a career path earlier on, particularly with the growth of the academic programs like the Lilly School and a couple other places have master's programs in this, or at least in philanthropy. But my gift planning journey kind of goes way back to like right out of high school, my first real job. First paycheck I ever got from an organization was from our local cemetery in my hometown. And I did odd jobs, mow the grass, do the weed whacking around things. But what I ended up doing a couple times a week was I actually helped dig the graves. They had a big piece of equipment, a backhoe that would dig the hole, but I would have to get into the hole with a shovel and square the corners off so that it was square all the way around. So I guess I might have been destined to be a gift planner because I started out as a grave digger. But that led to a law school experience, and I did a master's degree in sport management at the same time with this idea that I was going to be an athletic director when I grew up, and started to look for jobs at graduation time. And at least back then, athletics was a relatively hard fraternity to crack into if you weren't already in it. I had, for several summers after I quit digging graves, I actually worked for my dad. My dad owned a life insurance agency, and there was some notion that I might go back home and take over the agency at some point. And so I worked there for several summers, and my dad, God bless him, said, "Look, if you really want to do this, you need to know what you're getting yourself into." And he gave me a stack of files and a phone book and a telephone. He said, "Get on the phone and go out there and start selling." Because he said, "This is really an eat what you kill kind of proposition." And I found out a couple of things. One, I actually really loved going to meet people and hearing their stories and stuff. Two, I figured out I didn't really want to stay in my hometown for the rest of my life, and particularly selling life insurance in my hometown for the rest of my life. And so I had that as a background. And as I'm looking for these jobs coming out of law school, I started seeing philanthropy jobs in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And to make the story a little shorter, right out of law school, I was the assistant director of plan giving at Duke University. Now, tell me how I got that job. I still don't know. 40 years later, I still don't know how I got that job. I'm pretty sure I'll never know how I got that job. But but I did. And I've never done anything else. It got me on a career path that it's just been, I couldn't have picked a better career path for me than this. And that's how it got started.
What was that transition for you, like going from law school, which everyone you talk to in law school, they're looking at some type of firm or criminal, to being like, you know what, I'm going to do philanthropy. How did that mind switch work for you?
It was a mind switch because I was clerking at a medium-sized law firm in Columbus. And so when I told the people that I'd gotten this job, they kind of looked at me and said, "You're doing what?" And I said, "Yeah, this is what I want to do." I think that was the other experience I had. Was I spent one summer clerking for a sole practitioner, and then I spent my entire second year and my entire third year of law school clerking for this medium-sized firm. I think they had 25 lawyers. It was medium-sized back then. Today, that's a small firm, but back then that was a medium-sized firm. And And I kind of said, this is kind of fun, but I don't know that I really want to practice law either. It was it was almost like this process of elimination of things that I tried that I didn't really want to do, right? And so I kind of slipped into this. And so the transition was because you are like you said, you're really focused on particularly they teach in law school, and if you're clerking in a firm, there's certain things you do, managing your time and billing the clients and all that. Even in my firm, even the clerks, we had to bill our time out. So it was this really interesting kind of moving from that, and it was much more like doing the insurance work that I did for my dad. It's much more, okay, you need to start getting on the phone and calling people, and when somebody sends a response into your marketing, I mean, that's one of the things we did at that point in time at Duke. I thought our marketing was really pretty solid. And so we had a significant amount of leads that were coming from marketing. And so it's one of those, like you said, it's a mind shift, a perspective shift. But I think having that experience of insurance, it wasn't as big as it might have been otherwise. And I actually really relished the idea of like, okay, let's go see these people and let's see what's going on here.
When you got into the position at Duke, how did you go about learning the craft from there?
Well, this is really interesting, and I've joked about this. I don't think I ever told this story publicly before.
Great.
So, the person that hired me he was the director. So at that point in time, there was only two of us. There was a director of plan giving and an assistant director of plan giving. Now, that was just to put it in context for anybody that's listening to this. That was 1985. I mean, it was 40 years ago. And I think the plan giving office at Duke now has 12 or 14 or 15 people in it kind of thing. And so, it was a much different structure and time. So there really wasn't a great onboarding. I mean, there was a pretty decent onboarding, but in general to the institution. But as far as plan giving goes, I started like the 5th day of July, Monday, July the 5th. So it was right at the beginning of the fiscal year. And I was there for a week, and my boss was getting ready to take I think it was a 2-week vacation. And I don't know if you've ever seen these, Matt, because they don't necessarily exist anymore because everything is now online. But Conrad Teitel, the inimitable Conrad Teitel, who is still cooking at 93 years old, had these volumes, these treatises almost on plain giving. They were loose leaf, 8.5 by 11, and there was an introduction, and then there was like the guts of it. And there were 2 volumes, and they had to be 600 or 800 pages each. I mean, they were thick as that. And they were in a hard binder, and they were updated and all that kind of stuff. And so he literally came into my office like the day before he went on vacation, and he put those 2 volumes on my desk, and he said, okay, while I'm gone, I want you to read these. And when I come back, I'm going to give you a quiz on it. And you should know all the plain giving vehicles by the time I get back. And that was the extent of my training. And so that was it. I don't know that I necessarily like this, but for me, being thrown in the deep end was actually a pretty good thing because I either had to sink or swim, and I got thrown into the deep end, and I swam, obviously. And so I'm not sure. There are other people that does not work well for their style, but it worked well for me. And so, anyhow, that was it. But as a result of that, I've always just read everything I can get my hands on. And I think it started as that. The other thing that he did, which I thought was really interesting, is I was getting ready to make my first trip out of town on an airplane for Duke. I think I was going to Chicago. And he said to me the day before I left, he said, look, you need to remember something. He said, when you're going up there, you're on Duke's time. You're on Duke's time. You're not on your own time. So don't take a novel on the plane to read. Take some of this reading material. At that point, there were lots of plain giving newsletters that were produced and technical and otherwise. And he said, read those on the plane. Take the time to read on the plane and do work on the plane because you're in the air, but you're on Duke's time, and so you're working. So it's interesting. For 40 years, I've never done anything but that. I get on an airplane, and I consider the airplane as work time. And so I do a ton of reading and thinking about this. And so it's interesting how those things early in your career kind of like shape you.
You were at Duke for not long, right?
Yeah, I was only there a year, actually. It's a really interesting story. We got married on a Friday and moved to North Carolina on a Sunday. And we were going to get married about 3 months later. My wife had just finished a double master's at Bowling Green in college student personnel administration and in counseling. And almost everybody that has that master's degree, their first job is running a residence hall. And it was pretty obvious that I got this job at Duke, and there was an opening at Chapel Hill for a hall director, and there was an opening at NC State for a hall director. And so it seemed like it was highly likely that we were going to end up in a residence hall. And we thought to ourselves, now this is again 1985, and we're going into the South. And we were really unsure whether we were going to be allowed to cohabit prior to being married in a state-owned residence hall. We weren't really sure what we were going to do, so we said, "Oh, the heck with it, let's just get married." And so we dropped the big wedding and had a little family-only ceremony, got married, boom, and then moved to North Carolina. And so my wife ran a residence hall at NC State. If that apartment had 800 square feet, it had 8,000 square feet. I mean, it was a tiny little residence hall apartment. And 450 freshmen living above us. And we were just married. We were newly married. And so I lived at NC State, right? It took me 4 minutes to walk from our apartment to Reynolds Coliseum for basketball games. And so got kind of enmeshed in stuff on that campus as well as my work at Duke. And a mentor of my wife's met me and he said, "Well, we've got a couple openings here." And I said, "Well, I've only been at Duke for like 7 months. That doesn't," he goes, "I'll call the vice president." And so I thought, oh, who's going to take a candidacy seriously from someone who's applying for a job that they've only been in for 7 months, right? And next thing I know, I am the plan giving director at NC State. And so we lived in Raleigh for 6 years. And absolutely, I mean, Raleigh, the Research Triangle is fabulous. It's just a great place to live. And
That director position, was that running the gift planning for NC State?
yes, yes, because they only had one person in gift planning. And again, this is 85, and so they had a very small shop. I think there were 10 colleges at NC State, and there were like 14 gift officers, like one in each college, and then somebody doing plan giving and somebody doing corporate relations. And so I went from being in law school and thinking I was going to be in athletics to being the assistant director at Duke to being the director at NC State within 2 years.
Can you talk about that? Did you have people reporting to you at NC State, or was it just you?
Not at the beginning, but about 2 years in, I did. I mean, we were able to add some people and shift some things around, and about 2 years later, I did.
You had
So
a year's worth of foundation and gift planning, and then you're running a shop, building a shop. Like, how does that work? How does that feel? That's got to be kind of crazy to be like, I barely know what I'm doing.
it is kind of crazy. And I took the attitude that if I looked backwards, I was dead. That looking over my shoulder about it, does anybody notice that I'm an imposter here? I mean, there's that whole thing that is now developed over the last, oh, I don't know, 10 years or so about the imposter syndrome, right? There certainly wasn't anything like the imposter syndrome in 1986. And so it was just one of those, okay, I'm going to assume I know what I'm doing, and I'm just going to keep going forward until somebody tells me I don't. And that was kind of my attitude. And it's almost that fake it till you make it kind of thing. And again, fake it to make it was never even a term either. But, looking back on it, which I haven't thought about for a while, that's almost what it was.
So you're building that program and you start adding people underneath you. How did you realize that the program had gotten to the size where you could start expanding?
They had not done very much marketing. And again, I think that was the great thing about my experience at Duke was I got to see what really good plan giving marketing can produce if you do it right. And we're not doing anything. So we developed a marketing program, and all of a sudden the responses started coming in to the point where I couldn't handle all of them. And there's nothing worse than having a marketing program that says, "Hey, send this card back in or pick up the phone and call us or reach out to us on our website and we'll get back to you," and then take 2 or 3 weeks to get back to somebody just because you've got a queue and they get in line in the queue like everybody else does. There's nothing worse than that. And so we were getting to the point where the response time was getting over a week to respond, which is just unconscionable. I mean, you need to respond to that stuff within 24 to 48 hours. And that was what really got us. And we started having some success. Some gifts were closing, and there was more activity in the program than there had been in the previous period of time. And so there was a recognition like, okay, maybe there's something here. All that added together opened up some budget money to get some help.
You eventually left North Carolina State to go back home, right, to Columbus. So how did that come about?
That's an interesting story, or at least I think it's interesting. So, I said my wife went to Bowling Green, and so we get to Raleigh, and there's not a Bowling Green alumni club, and there's not an Ohio State alumni club. And so she started a Bowling Green alumni group, and I started an Ohio State alumni group. And when you do that, you start talking to the people back home at the university, the alumni people, and you start getting to know people. And the Ohio State Alumni Association at that time was pretty large, I mean, from a staffing perspective. And I actually met the director at a case conference. He was speaking at the Case 3, which was the Mid-Atlantic states, which NC State was in. And he came down to speak to that. And I went up to introduce myself. And he said, well, I've heard your name. Thank you for doing all this. And so he and I started a conversation. And I got to know him. And then, oh, I'm literally sitting at my desk one day. And the phone rings. And it's Dan Heinlein on the end of the phone. And he said, I got a proposition for you. I said, okay. He said, we're going to build a new building, and we just had a failed search for somebody to run the campaign for it. And your name just keeps coming up. And he said, would you mind coming up to Columbus and talking to us about this? Of course, my heart says yes, but my head was screaming no, because we were really settled in Raleigh. We had moved out of the residence hall. My wife had this fabulous job. She was running a student leadership center. They had just given her commencement to run at NC State. We were really enmeshed in the institution, into just the university itself. And we had great friends there, and it was great. And so, like, okay, do we really want to walk away from this kind of thing? That was a real decision for us. But I went up to interview, and they offered me the job. And my wife, having a student affairs background, they have all these like decision matrices and all these kind of things that you go through when you're thinking about a job or whatever. And so we went through that, and it just kept coming up. We just kept coming back to zero. It was never clear one way or the other in any decision matrix, right? And so finally, we were sitting there thinking, well, we've got to make a decision. And I think I'm pretty sure I said it. Maybe she said it. I'll give her credit for it. My wife says, I'll give her credit for it. She says, let's think about this. Let's get out a crystal ball and look forward 5 years. Are we going to be better off spending 5 more years at NC State, or are we going to be better off having moved to Columbus for this opportunity? And it was almost instantaneous. We looked at each other and said, we're moving. And it was closer to family. I grew up in Central Ohio. My wife grew up in Northwest Ohio. Her mom was beginning to be a little ill. It was one of those, we were thinking about having kids, all those kind of things. It all just kind of made all the sense in the world to move. And so we did.
And that's something that really resonates with me. And I think a lot of younger professionals, especially as gift planning opportunities seem to be more scattered, there's a lot of, if we have to move, my wife and I have sat down a couple of times. And I was like, do we leave Indiana? Is that something, not just the university, but the state of Indiana? Is that something we're able to do?
Right.
And that's such a hard choice and call to make for anyone.
Well, particularly when your family's there, and particularly if you have kids or you're thinking about having kids, and just that extended family infrastructure that's there. I hate to say this, but you kind of have to make a decision. And fortunately, I guess fortunately, we were making a decision that we thought was in our best interest professionally, that happened to align us closer to family kind of stuff. Now, like the situation you just said, if you had an opportunity to, let's just say, go to Duke. North Carolina is not that far from Indiana, but it stretches your supply lines, to use the military analogy, right? So that's a tough decision, and everybody has to make that decision on their own. And like you said, but it is really hard. It's a very tough decision. Do you balance the family and the career? And I think most people, like you have, I mean, you've discovered this, and that's what I think is great about the emerging professionals that you're doing at CGP, is answering these kind of questions. Is this a job or is this a career? Right? And pretty quickly, I saw this as a career. I didn't see this as a job. And if you see it as a career, then some of those decisions change. right? And you just moving for a job is moving for a job, but moving for your career to get you from point A to point B, which will lead to point C, is a whole different but
Yeah, that's a
contemplation.
great way of thinking about it when the whole moving from point A to point B to get to C because it's a career and not a job. That's a great way. Did that come from the decision trees you guys were looking at?
Yeah, it did. And it was like, yeah, this is a career. We have chosen this. I mean, she had her career and I had my career. Fortunately, we could do them, we could move together and both of us still have opportunities. But yeah, it's definitively
Yeah.
what it was. I mean, if the family thing was just a bonus, right? The decision was all about the career, 100% about the career.
What were some of the things that you learned and experienced at Ohio State?
So, again, from a career perspective, well, one of the things that I had this great fortune of doing when I was at NC State, several of the state schools in the Mid Atlantic have multiple foundations. Like each of the colleges will have a foundation. At one point, there was like, you could make a gift to NC State to one of 18 different 501c3 organizations that were all, because like the College of Agriculture had 4 foundations all by itself. But then there was this overarching university foundation. It was kind of just a catch-all because all the donors were at the college level and that kind of stuff. So there was just some staffing kind of thing. And the vice president asked me, he said, would you mind just taking on the NCSU Foundation while you are doing your plain giving job? It won't take that much time. There's a couple meetings a year, blah, blah, blah. And I said, sure. In the 2 years that I did that, or for a year and a half of that, the chair of the board of the NCSU Foundation was a man by the name of William Friday, who was the president of the University of North Carolina system. And if you go back into the higher education in the 60s and 70s and 80s and even into the 90s, there were 3 people that were higher education leaders. There was Clark Kerr at the University of California system, there was Father Hesburgh at Notre Dame, and there was Mr. Friday at the UNC system. And we all called him Mr. Friday. He was a lawyer, not a PhD. And so I had to go to his office about every 6 or 8 weeks to sit down and go over foundation kind of stuff. And just the master class that was. You walk into somebody's office and there's a picture of him with the Queen and a picture of him with the Pope and a picture of him with the President, right? A picture of him and Father Hesburgh. They co-chaired a committee or something. And it was like, holy smokes, this is, for a kid from Marion, Ohio, I was kind of in over my head. I was like, this is really, I can't believe I'm actually sitting in this man's office, much less talking to him, not quite as a peer, but he's asking me questions, asking my opinion on stuff, right? So I got this idea that maybe I wanted to be a college president someday, or at least a vice president. A valid career goal for me was to be a vice president at a university. And I thought to myself, one of the reasons the Ohio State thing was a good career fit initially was that I was running a small campaign. It was like a $6 million campaign to build a new building. Now think about that, $6 million to build a new building, right? That'll tell you the times that was. And I thought, well, it's going to be hard just to do nothing but plain giving and become the vice president. I'm going to have some campaign experience, right? And so I did that. And I found out pretty quickly that, oh yeah, this is fun, but man, I miss plain giving. I miss all the intellectual stimulation that plain giving was. I miss all of that. I miss picking up those newsletters and reading them every month from Conrad Teitel and everybody else. I was really fortunate that the plain giving director's job came open about 2 years after I started. I was fortunate enough to get it, and so I spent 14 years as the plain giving director at Ohio State. Again, a great learning experience. We had the university's first $1 billion campaign when I was the director, and the plain giving number was 200 million. At that point, we weren't as sophisticated on our counting as we were today. And so if someone had said, look, I have you in my will for X, let's just say it's $1 million, and that person happens to die and the estate was distributed before the campaign was over, that money ended up counting as cash, and I had to raise that $1 million all over again in order to get to we had to get that another $1 million to replace it in order to hit our plain giving goal. That was an interesting experience because we actually did have that happen in the last, like with 11 months to go in the campaign, like a significant person died and a significant amount and we had actually crossed the finish line. And then all of a sudden, with like 6 months to go in the campaign, we find out we're 4 million behind the finish line. We got there, But it was, that was a very interesting learning experience, and I'm pretty sure most places don't do that anymore in their accounting, but that's certainly how we did it. At least then, that's how we did it.
You had a very long career as an active fundraiser. What made you decide to go ahead and open up the Philanthropy Advisory Council?
That's another one of those things that I had, and I was fortunate enough that I actually sat in the VP chair, 2 different times, and I realized sometimes that is definitively a grass is greener on the other side. I may have thought I wanted to do it, but when I was sitting in the chair, I thought to myself, "Why did I do this?" And I want to get back into playing giving. That then became the next iteration of what's next 15 years ago. Well, I think I'd be kind of fun because I'd gotten to be friends with lots of people in our industry and that have done this for a long time, whether it's the late Robert Sharp was the first person that comes to mind and who was a dear friend. And I thought to myself, well, I'm never going to be Robert Sharp, but I could do something like that. And that became the next goal. Age 65 was always kind of my line because I had no intention of ever retiring at 65. But I thought, okay, if I actually make a switch at 65, that gives me plenty of space to do this and really try to do it at a high level. And yet I'm not doing it too early. Because I always loved the thing I loved about it, and the thing I didn't know whether I would like or not, was I loved the notion of the actual involvement with an organization. Knowing the people you work with, the donors themselves, the board, the other people that work in particularly the university, faculty and other kinds of staff members that have nothing to do with the advancement operation. I loved those relationships. I love the notion of being part of something that was bigger than myself, and which is what it is when you work at an organization, right? You're part of something that's bigger than yourself. And I loved that. And so that was one of the things that kind of held me back from just like hanging my shingle out and saying I'm on my own, because when you're on your own, you're on your own. There's not that built-in greater good kind of thing. But what I've discovered is that there is a greater good. It's just that there's multiple greater goods, which is kind of cool. I've gotten to see a lot of different types of organizations at various levels of maturity, I guess, and being able to help them. It has certainly filled that void of being part of something greater than myself. Is I've discovered that, oh, that part of what I like is definitively filled without all the problems of like doing performance reviews and budgets.
I did want to go back to something you said. You said the VP chair is one of those situations that it's definitely grass is always greener. I know with a lot of
Yeah.
going back to what we're talking about, like this being a career and you're trying to map out your potential path as a career, a lot of times a lot of people are looking at the AVP or VP chairs as part of that. So can
Sure.
you talk a little bit about
Sure.
why that is a situation where the grass is always greener? Or not always, but can be.
Or it can be. And I'm not saying I didn't like it. It's a different set of challenges, right? I used to say this when a couple years were around when I was chair of CGP. I used to say a lot. I actually said it in the chair's address at the conference that until more of us as gift planners actually become vice presidents, we don't have any stake in the game to complain about what we're getting from that vice presidents don't understand us kind of thing, until there's more of us in those chairs. And so I felt if I'm going to talk the talk, I better damn well walk the walk, right? And so that was one of the reasons I did it was like I kind of backed myself into a corner. Like I had to do it. And so there's just a different set of challenges. When you're the director of plan giving, and even if you're like an AVP of gift planning, your primary focus is still all that stuff in gift planning, right? It's the donors and it's the gift planning puzzle that we're trying to put together with each individual donor. But then when you sit in the big chair, perhaps your two biggest issues are budget and personnel. And both are important. And I found satisfaction in doing both, but I didn't find as much satisfaction in doing that as I did just actually doing the gift planning kind of stuff. And when you're the vice president, it's not only budget, it's just you're fighting for budget, right? Because there are always scarce resources. And if you're not careful, someone's going to take some of your seed corn away. And so you've got to fight to make sure that you have yours and that you have more. Because I think for those of us that do advancement work in a university or even at a hospital or even in any organization, it's common sense to us is that if we hire a new gift officer, the amount of money that's going to be raised is X and their salary is Y, and that difference of Z is pretty big. And so why would we not invest in that? Because it's a positive return every time. And yet there are other people, the chair of the chemistry department doesn't necessarily see it that way, right? And that's what's interesting when you're sitting in that DP chair is that if you really care about the institution, you understand that there are things that have to balance out, but yet your job is to advocate almost for your group to the exclusion of everybody else. And that always grated at me because it's like, no, we're part of the greater whole. I mean, I can make a great argument as to why you need to put extra money in my budget and not their budget. But at the end of the day, if that's in the best interest of the institution, then who am I to argue that? But that's a very tough balancing act right there.
This is changing directions a little bit. If I remember correctly, the first time I met you, you were doing a listening tour about the national standards.
Oh, yeah.
Was that, I know that was a big thing that the CGP was pushing, but was that also like something that you were seriously backing and wanting to push? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Like most things that have happened to me, and I guess maybe to other people too, there's definitively a long and winding road. You know, but McCartney and Lennon were quite right. There is a long and winding road to many things. And the standards were a long and winding road. So I had just gotten back into gift planning. So I was the VP at the Columbus Zoo. And I had gone to Carnegie Mellon as the AVP for gift planning. And I'm back in gift planning and I'm just having a ball. And I'm at the CGP conference. It was in Anaheim, and I remember it vividly. And I walk up to go up the elevator, and from another direction, somebody walks up to go up the elevator, and it's Greg Sharkey. And Greg was the chair of the board at that point in time. Now, Greg and I have been really dear friends for a very long time. And so we hadn't seen each other for, a month or a couple months. And we were saying, oh, we got to come all the way to Anaheim to see each other. And so we were talking. I said, Greg, I got to tell you something. Now that I'm back in this, I said, one of the things that I think that CGP needs to think about addressing is the whole notion of gift planning metrics, program metrics, and individual performance review metrics that gift planners themselves have to go through. Because I said, I am telling you, the number of people I hear complaining about they're being graded against major gift metrics and not their own metrics. I can't tell you the number of people I've heard that complain about that. And they're just different jobs. But again, it goes back to we don't have any plain giving people that are VPs, right? And so it's very easy to just do that. And Greg said, I think that's a really good idea. And the next thing I know, I'm chairing a task force to look at the whole concept of metrics. I won't bore you with the whole thing. I will say, though, that not long after I decided to do this, Robert Sharp said, are you an idiot? That's going to be impossible to do. And I said, well, it may be impossible, but I'm going to try it. We're going to try. Cut to the chase. And this was Catherine Myree who said this. She said, I wonder if we're looking at this wrong. And this is after we'd been doing this for 18 months or so. And we were moving forward, but every time we turned a corner, it felt like we ran into a wall. It was like we were in a maze. And she said, I think we might be looking at this a little wrong. Metrics is just one component of a greater situation. And she said, there isn't anything out there that says if you want to run a gift planning program, here are things that you should do to have a really productive gift planning program. And it was one of those light bulb moments. We all looked at each other and said, yeah, you're right. And so the standards came out of that. Like standard number 6 is all about metrics, right? And that was the sole focus of what we started to do. And yet that's just one of 16 standards. And so it was just a light bulb moment. It was like, she's right. And I will say this, Catherine had been working on this for quite some time. And she was willing to share her intellectual property, give her intellectual property to CGP. So a good portion of those 16 standards is Catherine Myree's original intellectual property that she donated selflessly to CGP. And I don't think we can ever forget that because they're great. I mean, I think the standards are fabulous. And I don't want to make this about my work, but we just completed an audit a few months ago of an organization's plan giving program, and we used the model standards as our roadmap. And I'm telling you, if you look at any program and you answer each one of those standards individually, you're going to get a really good analysis of where your program is and where your program can go. And I think that's the ultimate compliment to Catherine's original work and what we came up with.
That's fascinating. I'll have to talk to her about her work on that as well.
Yeah.
Now, to switch gears a little bit, something I've started to realize is some of you all that have been doing this for 30, 40 years might not have as many of these, but did you have any mentors when you got into gift planning?
Yes, actually. And they were mentors, not so much of there's a difference between a mentor who like you work for and then like a mentor who's more like a peer. And so most of my mentors, I think, were mostly peers. I worked for a vice president at Ohio State, Jerry May, who ended up being the VP at Michigan for a long time. And I still consider Jerry a mentor, and I will talk to Jerry periodically about stuff. But he was the ultimate principal. I've never met anybody that had better fundraising instincts than that man did. But he was a principal gift guy. So that aside, so go to your question about gift planning, it was just people that I met through CGP. It was Frank Minton. It was Emil Kalina. It was Bruce Bigelow. It was Terry Simmons. It was Craig Ruck. It was Catherine Myrie. There are other people that I would put there, but we were more like peers. We were kind of growing up together. So from a mentor perspective, it was Robert Sharp. It was those people.
Gonna make this a little bit more fun now. I mean, it's all been fun, but what
No,
was the
sure.
most fun or interesting gift that you ever worked on?
Ooh. And some of this is just, you can't make this stuff up. And some of it is as much the personalities of the donors. When I was at Ohio State, we had a couple. They were quote unquote sisters, but that was back in the day before they were able to actually be honest about what they were. And they lived in Pasadena and they were in their 80s. And I used to call them our little old ladies in Pasadena. There's a Beach Boys song, right? Their house was just classic. They had these like rubber coverings over all their furniture. And so you'd go and sit there and you'd sit there for a while and you'd start sweating and you'd start sticking to it. And it would be like, it's just, they were definitively good cop, bad cop. And Dorothy was as tough as nails. And it was a wonderful gift. It was an 8-figure bequest gift to the James Cancer Hospital at Ohio State, but it's those personalities that you think of. But one of the most interesting, just from a complicated perspective, was when I was at NC State, and there were brothers that had a dairy farm, and their dairy farm was contiguous to land that NC State owned, or a research farm. And this was back in the day when the federal government was paying some dairy farmers to quit being a dairy farmer because the milk supply was too big. And so they quit. They got out of the dairy business and they were real estate developers. And it was family land. And so there were two brothers, and they each had 50%, but they each had 3 kids. And they're like, okay, we're not going to keep subdividing this farm up. I mean, we're reaching a point where it doesn't make any sense for our kids to keep subdividing this land up. And so they got really interested in a charitable remainder trust. Well, then the question then became, is the university going to buy the land out of the charitable remainder trust? How are we going to do this? Because how do you monetize that land that you want to just hold on to in order to provide the income stream to these people? And there was another research plot 15 miles away that was right on the edge of a huge company near the Research Triangle Park, and they wanted that land for expansion. But there was like this 20-year grass study on this, and these professors were losing their mind over losing 15 years of research. What we ended up doing is they didn't want to build on it right away. They just wanted it for protection for the long term. They were willing to do it like a rent-free 20-year lease kind of thing. The property that the brothers are putting into the CRT actually was within hundreds of dollars of being appraised at the same price as that smaller plot that was over that the company wanted. So what we did was we swapped out the pieces of the parcels, We sold the grass research parcel that was in the CRT to the company that wanted to buy it, which gave us enough cash in the CRT to provide them income. It then meant that we owned their dairy farm outright without a trust. The institution had it, and again, they were both living on it. We didn't care. Again, it was one of those things, we just didn't want somebody else putting a subdivision in there, because that was definitively an option for them. Is just, look, we're just going to put a subdivision in here, because it was like 80 acres and it was going to be quite the subdivision. That was not only complex just from the mechanics that I just said, but the internal politics were unbelievably complex. So from a complexity perspective, that might be one of the most complex things I ever dealt with, just because of how many players that were involved and how many different vested interests were involved in that whole process. But it worked out.
Do you have any advice or comments that you hadn't had a chance to say, but you're like, this is something I want to get out into the world before this ends?
I think we hit on a lot of stuff. I still think, and particularly if we've got a lot of the emerging professionals that are listening to this, I still think making the decision, is this my career or is this my job? And again, I am not unbiased in this. I think that this is a fabulous career for anybody that feels like this is the direction they want to go. But you need to kind of make that decision. And then the other thing is, I think if you're a really good gift planner, you can never stop learning, because there's always something going on. Whether it's new legislation, whether it's a tax thing, whether it's, there are a lot of smart people that try to use some of the gift planning vehicles and try to push those to the absolute limits. It might not be the best thing to do, but you need to know about those. I mean, the amount of things that I think a good gift planner should know, maybe not needs to know, but should know, is vast, and it just never ends, which I think is one of the great things about this. You need to be really curious to be a good gift planner, I think, because it's curious about stuff like what we were just saying, but it's also curious about donors, right? If I had to pick my number one trait for a gift planner, it would be curiosity.
That's a good one. Yeah.
And curiosity takes, like I said, just takes lots of different forms.
Question: who in your phone would you love to hear on this podcast?
Ooh. Well, we had just mentioned Catherine Myrie. I think would be fabulous because of what she's done over her career and everything. I'm trying to think of people that aren't like my age, like people that have a different story than like somebody my age would have, right? You know who would be an interesting interview, actually, was the person that I hired at Carnegie Mellon, who is now their AVP for gift planning, Mick Koster, because Mick comes at this. Mick just doesn't jump on the conventional wisdom because it's the conventional wisdom. Now, he does a lot of things that are conventional wisdom, but because it's what makes sense to him. But he has a really interesting background. Like, he worked at Comerica for a long time. So he worked at it as a plain giving person at Comerica for a really long before he got into that. And you want to talk about somebody that's got great donor stories. If you just wanted to like just open up and talk to him about donor stories, that guy's got great donor stories of like some stuff. So, yeah.
Sounds good. I'll add him to the list. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
My pleasure.
Anything else you have? Or if not, then this has been a pleasure.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate
that.
Like
I said, I remember the first time meeting you was the standards, and then you just got Hall of Fame. So it's like, got to have him on here. So
yeah, I know. I have not quite completely come back to earth yet. I have to be really honest with you. It was just really, really cool that the number of people, because there's one thing about when somebody comes and says, hey, nice job. But then there's a whole other thing when someone says, I'm really glad that this happened to you, or I've read all the stuff you've written, or I've gone to your seminars, or I've gone, it's like the amount of just like really heartfelt kind of things that I received that week in Indianapolis was just, I can't even begin to describe how gratifying and heartening and
yeah,
it was just to get all that stuff.
Well, this has been great. Thank you.
It's been great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you for joining us on Dead Giveaway, where every gift tells a story. A big thank you to Joe Bull for sharing his experience with us. This concludes season 1 of Dead Giveaway. We will be taking the month of July off to enjoy the summer, but we'll be back in August to share more incredible journeys and the stories that accompany them. None of this would be possible without my amazing producer, Jessica Hall, and the support of the entire National Association of Charitable Gift Planners staff. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please share the show and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for listening to Dead Giveaway, where generosity lives on.